Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to create a legacy BIOS and MBR bootable Windows 11 USB drive using PowerShell in Windows 10 and Windows 11. We'll use PowerShell to prepare the USB drive, configure it with the MBR partition style, format the drive, and copy the Windows 11 installation files. The best part is that you don't need to use any third-party software such as Rufus or other USB creation tools. Everything can be done using the tools already available in Windows. This method is useful when you need a Windows 11 USB drive that can boot on a computer using legacy BIOS instead of UEFI. Before we start creating the bootable Windows 11 USB drive, let's first understand what legacy BIOS and MBR mean, and why they are commonly used together. Legacy BIOS is the traditional firmware interface used by older computers to initialize the hardware and start the operating system. It is the older firmware standard, while UEFI is the newer firmware standard used on most modern computers. MBR, or Master Boot Record, is a disk partitioning scheme. The MBR is located at the beginning of the drive and contains the partition table and boot information used by traditional or legacy BIOS systems. Legacy BIOS and MBR are related because a computer configured to boot in legacy BIOS mode typically expects the bootable drive to use the MBR partition style. So, in simple terms, legacy BIOS is the traditional firmware and boot method, while MBR is the disk partition style. Now, let's prepare the USB drive using PowerShell. Make sure the USB drive has at least 16 GB of storage capacity for the Windows 11 installation files. The USB drive will be formatted during this process, so all data currently stored on the USB drive will be erased. Make sure you back up any important files before continuing. Once the USB drive is connected, open the Start menu and type PowerShell in the search box. Then select Run as Administrator to launch PowerShell with administrative privileges. If prompted by User Account Control, click Yes to allow it to run with administrative privileges. This will open an elevated PowerShell window, which is required to perform disk operations and create the bootable USB. Now, we need to identify the disk number of your USB drive. In the PowerShell window, type Get Disk and press Enter. This will display a list of all available disks connected to your system. Look for your USB drive in the list by checking its size. Once you find it, take note of its disk number, as we'll use that in the next steps. Next, define a variable named disk number and initialize it with the integer value of the disk number that corresponds to your USB drive. Next, define a variable named ISO path and store the full file path to your Windows 11 ISO file. To find the ISO file path, open File Explorer and navigate to where your Windows 11 ISO is located. Then, right-click on the file and select Copy as Path. This will copy the full file path, which you can then paste into your PowerShell script as the value for the ISO path variable. Next, use the getDiskCMD let with the disk number variable, then pipe it to setDisk to set the isRead-only property to false. This removes the read-only attribute from the selected disk, allowing it to be modified in the next steps. This step ensures that the USB drive can be properly prepared, formatted, and used to store the Windows 11 bootable files without any permission or access issues. The getDiskCMD let together with disk number variable retrieve the specific disk object from the system. By using the pipeline operator, the command takes the disk object returned by getDisk, based on the disk number stored in disk number, and sends that object directly as input to setDisk. The setDiskCMD let is then used to modify properties of that disk. By setting the isRead-only parameter to false, you are explicitly telling Windows to remove the read-only attribute from the disk. Next, use the getDiskCMD let with the disk number variable, then pipe it to clear disk with the remove data and remove OEM parameters enabled, and set confirm to false. This removes all existing partitions, stored data, and OEM partition information from the selected USB drive without showing a confirmation prompt. It prepares the drive as unallocated space, making it ready for creating new partitions and formatting for the Windows 11 bootable USB setup. The getDiskCMD let together with disk number variable retrieve the specific disk object from the system. By using the pipeline operator, the command takes the disk object returned by getDisk, based on the disk number stored in disk number, and sends that object directly as input to clear disk. The clearDiskCMD let is then used to remove existing partition information and disk configuration data from the drive. By including the remove data parameter, the command also erases partition and volume metadata, making the disk appear uninitialized or empty. By including the remove OEM parameter, the command removes any OEM partitions and their metadata, such as manufacturer-created recovery or diagnostic partitions, making the disk completely clean and ready for repartitioning. By explicitly setting the confirm parameter to false, the command suppresses the confirmation prompt. A confirmation prompt is a pop-up message that can appear inside File Explorer when you perform certain actions. Next, use the getDiskCMD with the disk number variable to select the target USB drive, then pipe the disk object to the setDiskCMD with the partition style parameter set to MBR. This configures the USB drive to use the master boot record or MBR partition style, which is required for legacy BIOS systems to properly detect and boot from the Windows 11 installation USB drive. The getDiskCMD together with disk number variable retrieve the specific disk object from the system. By using the pipeline operator, the command takes the disk object returned by getDisk, based on the disk number stored in disk number, and sends that object directly as input to setDisk. The setDiskCMD is then used to modify properties of that disk. By setting the partition style parameter to MBR, the command configures the selected disk to use the master boot record or MBR partition style, which creates a legacy partition structure commonly used for BIOS boot systems. MBR is a traditional disk partitioning format used to organize partitions and store boot information on a storage device. It is one of the oldest partition styles and is commonly used in systems that boot using legacy BIOS firmware. Next, define a variable named USB partition and store the partition object returned by the new partition CMD with the disk number parameter set to the disk number variable, the use maximum size parameter enabled, the assign drive letter parameter enabled, and the isActive parameter enabled. This creates a primary partition that uses the full available space on the USB drive, automatically assigns a drive letter, and marks the partition as active so legacy BIOS systems can recognize it as a bootable partition during startup. The USB partition variable stores the partition object returned by the new partition CMD. The new partition CMD is used to create a new partition on a physical disk. By setting the disk number parameter to the value stored in the disk number variable, the command identifies the target disk on which the new partition will be created. By including the use maximum size parameter, the command creates the new partition using all available unallocated space on the selected disk. By including the assign drive letter parameter, the command automatically assigns an available drive letter such as D, E, or F to the newly created partition so it becomes visible in File Explorer, but it is not yet usable until it is formatted with a file system. By including the isActive parameter, the command marks the newly created partition as active, allowing legacy BIOS systems to recognize it as a bootable partition. Next, use the format volume CMD with the partition parameter set to the USB partition variable, then set the file system parameter to NTFS and the new file system label parameter to Win11, with confirm set to false. This formats the USB partition using the NTFS file system, assigns it the label Win11, and prepares it for later use as a bootable partition. Formatting the volume removes any existing file structure on the partition and creates a clean file system that allows files to be stored and accessed properly. The format volume CMD is used to prepare the partition stored in the USB partition variable by writing a new file system to it, making it ready for data storage and system use. By setting the partition parameter to the value stored in the USB partition variable, the command specifies which partition object should be targeted for the operation. By setting the file system parameter to NTFS, the command formats the partition with the NTFS file system. By setting the new file system label parameter to Win11, the command assigns the volume label, Win11, to the newly formatted partition, making it easier to identify in File Explorer and disk management tools. By explicitly setting the confirm parameter to false, the command suppresses the confirmation prompt. Next, define a variable named USB drive and store the drive path created from the drive letter property of the USB partition variable, then append a character, : This builds the full drive letter path, such as E, or F, for the USB partition. The USB drive variable stores the drive letter of the partition contained in the USB partition variable, with a : appended to form a standard Windows drive path format such as E, or F. The USB partition variable contains the partition object returned earlier. By accessing the drive letter property, the command retrieves the drive letter assigned to the selected partition or volume. Next, define a variable named ISO and store the disk image object returned by the mount disk image command with the image path parameter set to the ISO path variable and the pass-through parameter enabled. This mounts the Windows 11 ISO file as a virtual DVD drive in the system. The ISO variable stores the object returned by the mount disk image CMD let. The mount disk image CMD let is used to mount an image file, such as an ISO file, as a virtual DVD drive in Windows. Once mounted, the contents of the ISO become accessible through File Explorer and PowerShell like a physical disk. By setting the image path parameter to the value stored in the ISO path variable, the command specifies the full file path of the ISO image that should be mounted. By including the pass-through parameter, the command returns the mounted disk image object after the operation completes, allowing it to be stored in the ISO variable for later use. Next, define a variable named ISO drive and store the drive path created from the drive letter property returned by piping the ISO variable to the getVolume CMD let, then append a :character. This retrieves the drive letter assigned to the mounted Windows 11 ISO file and builds the full drive path, such as D or E. The ISO drive variable stores the drive letter assigned to the mounted ISO image referenced in the ISO variable, combined with a :, to form a standard Windows drive path such as D or E. The parentheses are used to ensure that the command inside them runs first and returns a result before the next operation is performed. The ISO variable contains the disk image object returned earlier. By using the pipeline operator, the command passes the disk image object stored in the ISO variable directly to the getVolume CMD let as input. The getVolume CMD let retrieves information about the mounted volume associated with the ISO image. By accessing the drive letter property, the command extracts only the assigned drive letter from the returned volume object. The command then appends a :character to convert the drive letter into a standard Windows drive path format such as D. Next, use the copy item CMD let with the path parameter set to all files and folders from the mounted ISO drive stored in the ISO drive variable, then set the destination parameter to the USB partition stored in the USB drive variable, with the recurse, force, and verbose parameters enabled. This copies the complete contents of the mounted Windows 11 ISO drive to the USB partition. The copy item CMD let is used to copy files or folders from one location to another without removing the original content. By setting the path parameter to the value of all files and folders located inside the mounted ISO drive stored in the ISO drive variable, the command specifies the source location of the content that will be copied from the mounted ISO drive. By setting the destination parameter to the value stored in the USB drive variable, the command specifies the target location on the USB partition where all copied files and folders will be placed. By enabling the recurse parameter, the command copies all files, subfolders, and nested content inside the mounted ISO drive. By enabling the force parameter, the command allows existing files or folders to be overwritten and helps prevent errors if destination items already exist. By enabling the verbose parameter, the command displays detailed output showing which files and folders are being copied during the operation. Wait for the copy operation to complete. This may take several minutes, depending on the speed of your USB drive. Do not disconnect the USB drive while the files are being copied. Once the copy process is complete, you can proceed to the next step. Next, use the call operator to run the bootsect.exe file located inside the boot folder on the mounted ISO drive stored in the ISO drive variable, then use the NT60 parameter set to the USB drive variable and include the force parameter. This updates the USB drive's boot sector with BOTMGR compatible boot code, allowing legacy BIOS systems to properly recognize the USB drive and start the Windows 11 installation process. By using the call operator, the command executes the bootsect.exe program located inside the boot folder of the mounted ISO drive stored in the ISO drive variable. The bootsect.exe tool is a Windows command line utility used to update the boot sector code on a partition, making it compatible with legacy BIOS boot mode by applying the appropriate Windows boot code. By setting the NT60 parameter to the value stored in the USB drive variable, the command specifies the target partition where Windows-compatible boot code will be written. Finally, use the dismount disk image CMD let with the image path parameter set to the ISO path variable. This safely unmounts the Windows 11 ISO file from the system. The dismount disk image CMD let is used to remove a mounted disk image file, such as an ISO, VHD, or VHDX, from Windows by disconnecting its virtual drive. By setting the image path parameter to the value stored in the ISO path variable, the command specifies the mounted ISO file that will be dismounted from the system. After safely unmounting the Windows 11 ISO, open File Explorer and go to this PC. Under Devices and Drives, you should see your USB drive listed with the label Win11. At this point, the legacy BIOS and MBR bootable Windows 11 USB drive is complete and ready to use. And that's it. We have successfully created a legacy BIOS and MBR bootable Windows 11 USB drive using PowerShell in Windows 10 or Windows 11, without using any third-party software. You can use it to install Windows 11, perform system recovery, or reinstall Windows 11 on compatible legacy BIOS systems. If you found this tutorial helpful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more tutorials. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.